Summer promised to be unforgettable. Jake, who had just finished his sophomore year of high school, finally landed his first real job. The local water park, the biggest attraction in their small town, became his new workplace. It was everything he had dreamed of: bright sunshine, fresh air, the joyful screams of children having fun on the water slides, and, of course, the chance to earn some money. He imagined carefree days full of new friends and fun. The first few days of work lived up to Jake's expectations. He quickly got the hang of things, picking up trash, helping visitors find their belongings, and even occasionally filling in as a lifeguard at the pool. The park staff turned out to be friendly, and Jake quickly found common ground with his coworkers. They often had small parties after the park closed, enjoying cold drinks and sharing stories about funny incidents at work. However, from the very beginning, Jake noticed something strange about the park. Everything seemed perfect: happy families, laughter, and joy, but there was something unsettling in the air. Sometimes, when he was alone, he felt as if someone was watching him. He chalked it up to exhaustion and the excitement of a new job, but the feeling didn't go away. In the evenings, when the park closed and the lights dimmed, the water park became a completely different place. The loud shouts and splashing water were replaced by silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the quiet gurgle of water in the pools. The park, which seemed so fun and bright during the day, took on a sinister tone. One day, as Jake was heading back to the locker room after a long day at work, he heard a faint rustle behind him. He turned around but saw no one. His heart started to race, but he tried to calm himself, convincing himself it was just the wind. Still, the feeling that someone was watching him lingered. Nevertheless, Jake tried not to dwell on his fears. He was determined to make the most of this summer, learn something new, and save up money for the car he had long dreamed of. Working at the water park, he felt like part of something bigger than just a job. But he didn't yet know that this feeling would soon evolve into something much more serious, and this summer would be not just a time of fun, but a true test. Days at the water park went by in their usual rhythm. Jake was gradually getting used to his new job and even began to enjoy the monotony of some tasks. He already knew when the crowds would arrive and when there would be a chance to relax a little. The weather was scorching hot, which drew more and more people to the park, eager for a cool escape and some fun. On one of these sweltering days, when the park was packed, Jake noticed him. George, a large man with an intimidating presence, entered the water park as if he owned the place. Jake immediately took note of his behavior. George spoke loudly, laughed boisterously, and roughly pushed people aside as he made his way to the pool. He wore black sunglasses and a red baseball cap, which seemed somewhat out of place in the setting. George acted as if everyone else owed him something. At first, Jake decided not to get involved. He was a new employee, and his job was to maintain order, not to get into confrontations with guests. However, George's behavior became increasingly provocative. He ignored the signs instructing visitors to follow the rules, jumped over barriers to cut through the park, and seemed to relish the discomfort his antics caused other guests. Jake wasn't the only one who noticed George. His coworkers were talking about him behind his back, but no one dared to approach and confront him. George seemed to sense their fear, which only made him bolder. Soon, his behavior turned downright dangerous. He pushed children aside without hesitation as he made his way to the water rides and even hurled loud, offensive comments at the park staff. As Jake watched this unfold, he realized that sooner or later, he would have to step in. He recalled the training he had received before starting the job. The safety of the guests was the top priority for the water park employees. But how could he deal with someone like George? This question began to trouble him more and more with each passing minute. At one point, Jake noticed George climbing to the highest tower and starting to swing on the edge, something that was strictly forbidden. This time, Jake couldn't stay on the sidelines. He quickly approached George and, trying to keep his voice calm, said, "Excuse me, sir, but you're breaking the park's rules. I need to ask you to come down." George slowly turned to Jake. His gaze from beneath the sunglasses was heavy and cold. "And what if I refuse?" George challenged, his voice full of menace. Jake hesitated for a moment but then gathered his courage. He knew that in a situation like this, showing fear was not an option. "Then I'll have to call security," Jake replied firmly. George laughed as if he had heard a good joke. But to Jake's surprise, he complied, slowly climbing down from the tower. Never taking his eyes off the young man. "You'll regret getting involved," George muttered quietly but clearly as he passed by Jake. Those words sounded like a threat, and Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He knew this was not the kind of person who would forget such a moment. The day went on, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was looming on the horizon. The heat that day reached its peak, and the water park was packed. Families with children, groups of teenagers, couples, all were seeking some relief and fun in the water. But alongside the crowds, the tension caused by George's presence was becoming increasingly palpable. George returned to the park the next day, and his behavior immediately became even more provocative. He cut in line at the most popular attractions as if the park's rules, which everyone else had to follow, didn't apply to him. People grumbled, but no one dared to speak up. Jake's co-workers, who were stationed at the slides, exchanged worried glances but tried to avoid a confrontation with the brute. Sensing his dominance, George continued to push past other guests to get ahead. His loud voice drowned out the noise of the water park, and his sharp commands left the staff flustered. He demanded immediate access to every slide and didn't hesitate to use force to get what he wanted. Several times, he shoved children and teenagers who tried to stand in line before him, and he even shouted at parents who attempted to intervene. Jake watched this unfold with growing concern. His co-workers tried to calm George down, but to no avail. Every time someone attempted to speak to him, George either completely ignored them or snapped back, insisting that he had the right to do whatever he pleased. Jake saw one of the employees, Eric, timidly approach George and suggest that he move to a different attraction, but George just laughed in his face and shoved him aside. The day at the water park went on as usual, but the tension brought by George's presence continued to escalate. Jake tried to focus on his duties, but his eyes kept drifting back to George, who seemed to deliberately find ways to annoy and unsettle everyone around him. The climax came closer to noon when George, having had his fun causing trouble at various attractions, made his way to the pool with the diving towers. A group of kids had already gathered on the platform, waiting for their turn to jump into the water. Ignoring the line, George headed straight for the ladder leading up to the tower. The younger kids, seeing him approach, exchanged frightened glances and stepped back, giving way to the brute. One boy, standing closest to the edge, clenched his fists and took a step forward, clearly not willing to give up his spot. This seemed to anger George. Without hesitation, he grabbed the boy by the shoulder and shoved him toward the edge. The crowd around them froze, watching as the boy lost his balance and fell into the pool. Water splashed high into the air, accompanied by frightened screams. Jake, who was nearby, instantly jumped over the barrier and dove into the water after the boy. The water was cool, and Jake momentarily lost his bearings, but then he spotted the boy struggling to swim to the surface. Jake quickly swam over and supported him until they both emerged from the water. The boy started coughing but was thankfully unharmed. The crowd on the shore buzzed with nervous chatter about what had just happened. The boy's parents rushed to the pool, their faces full of horror and anger. George, however, stood at the edge of the tower, smirking as he watched the commotion. As Jake helped the boy out of the water, he felt a surge of anger rising within him. This had gone too far. Once the boy was safely on shore, Jake stood up and addressed George. "You need to leave the park immediately." His voice was firm, though he still felt a slight tremor inside. George descended from the tower and walked up to Jake, stopping just inches from his face. "And what are you going to do about it?" he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery and contempt. "You'll be the one leaving, not me." Jake, feeling the eyes of the crowd on him, knew he had to act. He couldn't let George stay here, where he posed a threat to everyone's safety. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "I'm calling the police," he said, not breaking eye contact with George. Those words made George freeze for a moment, but then he shot Jake one last angry look and headed toward the exit. There were murmurs of discontent in the crowd, but no one dared to stop him. Jake, gripping the phone in his hand, knew he couldn't just let George walk away. He rushed after him, closing the distance between them in a few quick strides. George walked fast, but his confident stride started turning into a hurried pace as he heard Jake's footsteps drawing closer. George glanced back and, seeing the persistent teenager, cursed under his breath and quickened his pace. They crossed the central area of the water park, where it seemed like everyone had stopped to watch the unfolding drama. Realizing he needed to act fast, Jake shouted, "Stop, this isn't going to end well for you." But George only shot him a furious glare and sprinted towards the locker rooms, where there were usually fewer people. Jake, sensing the situation was spiraling out of control, continued the chase, refusing to let George out of his sight. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel the blood pulsing in his ears. He knew George could be dangerous, but he had to do something. As George dashed into the locker room building, he glanced over his shoulder to gauge how close Jake was. Once inside the dimly lit space, George abruptly turned a corner, hoping to find an exit through a back door. Jake, not far behind, raced after him. But as soon as Jake rounded the corner, he realized he'd made a mistake. It was too quiet, and the building felt like a maze. He came to a sudden stop, looking around and realizing that George could ambush him at any moment from behind a corner. Jake knew that chasing George in such a confined space was too risky. His instincts told him it was time to change tactics. He spotted a door marked, "Staff Only," and, without hesitation, ducked inside, closed the door behind him, and pressed his back against the cold wall. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. Jake took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, and then remembered he still had the phone in his hand. He immediately dialed 911. "911, what's your emergency?" came the voice of the operator. "This is Jake Fisher. I work at the water park. There's been a serious incident. One of the visitors pushed a kid off the diving tower, and now he's running and acting very aggressively. I'm hiding in a staff room, and he could be dangerous." "I don't know what to do," Jake said, barely able to keep the tremor out of his voice. "Jake, stay where you are. We're sending a police unit to your location. Hang in there and stay on the line." Jake nodded, even though the operator couldn't see him, and slowly slid down to the floor, trying not to make any noise. In the darkness of the staff room, he began to fully grasp the gravity of the situation. A few minutes passed, feeling like an eternity to Jake, when he finally heard muffled footsteps and radio chatter outside the door. He pressed the phone to his ear, hoping to hear the familiar voice of the operator. "Jake, the police are on the scene. Stay where you are," the voice came from the other end of the line. Jake let out a heavy sigh, relief mingling with tension. Seemingly in charge, was directing the others, positioning them at various points in the building. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone understood that George was more than just an aggressive guest. Jake was led out of the building into the fresh air, where he saw that other police officers had surrounded the park's perimeter, cutting off all possible escape routes. People who had been enjoying their day at the water park just moments ago now stood behind barriers, watching the unfolding drama. Suddenly, George burst out of one of the locker room exits, his face twisted with anger and fear. He spotted the police and bolted in the opposite direction, but was immediately intercepted by two officers. A brief but intense struggle ensued. George fought back, trying to push them off, but the officers were trained and knew how to handle such situations. Within a minute, George was on the ground, his hands cuffed behind his back. He continued to shout, spewing threats and curses. Jake stood off to the side, watching the scene unfold, and only then did he begin to realize how close he had come to real danger. Soon, the senior officer approached him, holding a notepad. "You're Jake Fisher?" he asked, checking his notes. "Yeah, that's me," Jake replied, feeling the adrenaline start to drain from his body. "We need your statement. Can you describe what happened?" The officer spoke calmly, aware that Jake was still in shock from the ordeal. Jake nodded and began to recount everything in detail. How George had behaved in the water park, how his aggression had gradually escalated, and how he eventually pushed the boy off the diving platform. Jake described how he had tried to prevent further escalation and had been forced to hide and call the police. The officer listened carefully, taking notes in his pad. When Jake finished, the officer patted him on the shoulder. "You did the right thing, Jake. If it weren't for your quick thinking, the situation could have been much worse." "We'll take it from here," the officer said, nodding toward the patrol car where George was already being seated. But despite the officer's reassuring words, a sense of unease lingered in Jake. He tried to convince himself that it was over, but deep down, he knew that this incident had left a mark. The park, once a place of fun and carefree moments, would now forever be associated with that terrifying encounter. Several weeks had passed since the night George was arrested. Summer continued, and the water park was once again filled with laughter and splashes. It seemed like everything was returning to normal. Visitors who had witnessed the incident gradually forgot what had happened. The park employees resumed their usual duties, and Jake still couldn't forget. Outwardly, he remained the same as before. He kept working, smiling at guests, and maintaining order in the park. But inside, something had changed. Every time he walked past the locker rooms, he recalled that night. Again and again, the image of George struggling in the hands of the police, his distorted face, and his menacing shouts flashed before his eyes. It had left a deep mark that wasn't fading with time. Jake tried to brush off these thoughts, attributing everything to the aftermath of stress. But fear had settled inside him, quietly but persistently, eroding his sense of security. Every evening when he returned home, a wave of anxiety would wash over him. The simple silence of his room, whether he was sitting at his computer or lying in bed, felt unbearably loud. Occasionally, he began to think he heard strange noises, a rustling at the window, footsteps in the hallway, the slam of a door. It's just nerves, Jake told himself, but each evening grew more restless. Nightmares became a regular occurrence. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat, gasping for air as if he had been fleeing from something terrifying. Again and again, he dreamed that George had somehow escaped from prison and had come back for him. In his dreams, George chased Jake through an empty water park, which suddenly turned dark, covered in shadows. Jake would run, but George's footsteps were always too close. He always woke up at the moment when George was just about to catch him. At work, Jake tried to distract himself, but the anxiety would strike suddenly and without warning. Sometimes, he thought he saw George's familiar features among the visitors. His heart would start racing when he noticed a large man in the distance. And only after a closer look would he realize it was someone else entirely. "It's all in my head," he repeated to himself, trying to regain control. But as time went on, the feeling grew stronger that the encounter with George was more than just an unpleasant incident in the park. It was as if George's shadow had stayed with him, haunting him even in the most ordinary moments. Jake stopped staying home alone and more often invited friends over or went to visit them. Even in a crowd, he felt a little better. But as soon as he was alone, the anxiety would immediately return. The summer, which had begun as the perfect time for relaxation and fun, had now turned into endless days of fear and tension. Jake knew he needed to do something about it, but he didn't know how to deal with the feeling that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Jake was finishing up his workday when his boss, Mr. Peters, approached him with a serious expression. Usually calm and friendly, today he looked worried, which immediately put Jake on edge. "Jake, I have some news, and I think you need to hear it," Mr. Peters began, looking at him over the top of his glasses. "What happened?" Jake asked, feeling his heart start to race. "This morning, I received a message from the police. George has been released on bail." Mr. Peters's words hit Jake like a punch to the chest. He froze, trying to process what he had just heard. "Released?" he repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "But how? He's dangerous." Mr. Peters sighed and placed a reassuring hand on Jake's shoulder, trying to calm him. "I understand that this is hard to accept, especially after everything that happened. But according to the law, if someone is released on bail, they are freed until the trial unless they are considered a direct threat. Of course, the police will be monitoring him, but I know that doesn't ease your concerns." Jake remained silent, struggling to grasp the situation. The thought of George being free again began to stir panic within him. Horrible scenarios started to play out in his mind. What if George wanted revenge? What if he showed up at the park again? Jake felt all the fears he had tried to suppress coming back with new intensity. "Thanks for telling me, Mr. Peters," Jake finally responded, though his voice sounded hollow. "We're all here to support you, Jake. If you ever feel uncomfortable, just say the word. We'll do everything we can to make sure you feel safe." "I'll try," Jake mumbled, nodding as he headed for the exit. That evening, he felt like he was moving through a fog. The news about George lingered in his mind, giving him no peace. Every step on the way home seemed threatening, every passerby a potential danger. He couldn't shake the feeling that George might suddenly appear from around a corner and attack him. Lying in bed, Jake couldn't sleep. He listened to every sound, each creak of the floorboards or rustle of the wind outside making him jump. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw George, menacing and unpredictable. "What will I do if he comes back?" Jake whispered to himself in the dark. But there were no answers. There was only the fear that was slowly but surely taking over his mind. The days following the news that George had been released on bail were filled with tension. Jake tried to focus on his daily duties, but fear and anxiety never left him. He felt out of place, as if something was constantly hanging over him, threatening to crash down at any moment. One evening, when Jake was home alone, his phone rang. Startled by the sudden noise, he picked up the receiver. "Hello?" Jake asked, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. There was no response. On the other end of the line, there was nothing but dead silence. Jake listened intently, trying to catch any sound, but he heard nothing. Then the call ended. Jake put the phone down and sat in his chair for a while, unsure of what had just happened. He decided not to dwell on it, chalking it up to a wrong number. But when the phone rang again a couple of hours later, and the same thing happened, his anxiety surged. The next day, the calls continued. Every time Jake answered the phone, there was silence on the other end. Sometimes he could hear faint breathing, but no one ever spoke. Jake was beginning to lose his composure. He was convinced that George was trying to intimidate him. Barely able to handle another one of these calls, Jake decided to tell his parents everything. At dinner, he gathered his courage and, overcoming his fear, began to speak. "Mom, Dad, I need to talk to you," he began, putting down his fork and looking at his parents. "What's wrong, son?" his mother asked with concern. "I've been getting strange phone calls," Jake continued. "Actually, I think it's the same person calling. They don't say anything, just stay silent. This has been happening for several days, and I think it's George." His father, John, frowned as he listened to his son. "Are you sure?" he asked, trying to remain calm. "Maybe someone's just playing a prank. Or it could be a mistake. I thought that at first, too, but it's happening too often to be a coincidence," Jake countered. "Jake," his mother began cautiously, "you've been through a lot of stress, and that's understandable. That incident could have left a mark on you. Sometimes our minds play tricks on us when we're afraid of something." "But this isn't a trick," Jake insisted. "I'm sure it's George. He knows I testified against him. Maybe he wants revenge." His parents exchanged worried glances. But uncertainty was evident in their eyes. "We understand your concerns," his father said. "But without any proof that it's George, maybe you should give yourself some time to calm down. If the calls continue or things get worse, we'll contact the police." Jake realized that his parents didn't take his words seriously. Despite their support, he felt alone in his fear. He knew he had to stay vigilant because he couldn't allow himself to become a victim again. The next morning, Jake woke up with a heavy heart. The anxiety wouldn't go away, and he knew he couldn't stay in this state any longer. The calls hadn't stopped, and now every ring of the phone made him jump. He realized that he had to do something, and the only thing that came to mind was going to the police. After breakfast, Jake decided not to put it off any longer. He knew his parents wouldn't support his decision, so he went to the station alone. The walk to the police station only took a few minutes, but it felt endlessly long. His hands were sweating, and his heart was pounding. When he entered the building, he was greeted by the desk officer, Sergeant Raymond. "How can I help you, son?" the officer asked kindly, noticing the anxiety on Jake's face. "I need to talk to someone about some threats," Jake began, trying to keep his nerves in check. "I've been getting anonymous calls, and I'm sure it's George, the guy you arrested earlier this summer." Raymond frowned slightly at the mention of George's name but quickly regained his composure. "George, you say? The guy we arrested at the waterpark?" he asked for confirmation. "Yes," Jake confirmed. "I testified against him, and now I think he wants revenge." The officer nodded and offered Jake a seat. A few minutes later, Detective Clark, who had been assigned the case, entered the room. "Jake, nice to meet you," Clark said, sitting down across from the teenager. "I hear you're worried about some phone calls?" "Yeah," Jake began, feeling his voice start to tremble. "I think it's George. He doesn't say anything, but I'm sure it's him. He's out on bail, and maybe he wants to scare me into withdrawing my testimony or something like that. Clark listened intently, but his expression showed that he wasn't particularly impressed. Listen, Jake, I understand that you're scared, the detective said gently. But these could just be random calls. We checked on George after he was released. He doesn't have a criminal record, and he's not allowed to be near you or the water park as part of his bail conditions. And if he wanted to do something, it's unlikely he'd draw attention to himself with calls like this. But what if he's planning something? Jake persisted. I can't just sit around and wait for him to show up at my house or something worse. Clark sighed and looked at the boy with sympathy. I understand that what you went through was very difficult for you. We know George isn't someone who follows the rules, but right now we don't have any reason to believe he's violating his bail conditions. We'll keep an eye on the situation, but if you feel your life is in danger, I suggest you talk to your parents and maybe even consult with a psychologist. It's not that we don't believe you, it's just that sometimes our fears can seem bigger than they really are. Jake felt disappointed. He had hoped the police would take his concerns more seriously. Thanks, Jake said, standing up. We'll stay in touch, Clark added, walking him to the door. As Jake stepped outside, his fears hadn't gone away. He knew George was still out there and that the calls would likely continue. All he could do was hope that his intuition was wrong, but deep down, he felt that trouble was still ahead. Several days had passed since Jake had gone to the police. On Saturday morning, Jake decided to distract himself by visiting the local mall to buy a new t-shirt. He loved this place. It was noisy, bright, and full of people. He always felt safe here. After browsing through a few stores, he stopped in front of a display featuring the latest collection. Admiring the clothes, at that moment, he felt as if someone was watching him. He quickly turned around and froze, seeing George. George was standing just a few steps away, among the shoppers, as if he were simply another passerby. He was dressed in plain clothes, nothing remarkable, but his sullen appearance instantly brought back memories of that horrifying situation at the water park. Their eyes met, and Jake felt his heart start pounding in his chest. Seconds felt like an eternity as Jake stared directly into George's eyes. He expected George to say something, show aggression, or do something to confirm his fears. But George only slightly raised his eyebrows, as if surprised by the encounter, and continued to stand still, not moving or saying a word. Jake didn't know what to do. Inside him, fear and the urge to act were at war. He wanted to run, but his legs felt as if they were glued to the floor. He tried to understand what this silent contact meant. George wasn't doing anything threatening, wasn't trying to approach. But his mere presence was intimidating. Finally, George slowly turned away and, as if nothing had happened, continued to move through the crowd. Jake, still standing in place, felt utterly helpless. He realized that this silent gesture was even more terrifying than if George had started shouting or making threats. It was like a reminder, I'm here, and I know where to find you. After the encounter, Jake couldn't continue his shopping calmly. He quickly headed for the exit, trying to leave the mall as fast as possible. The entire way home, he felt as though he was being watched. That brief but frightening moment convinced him that the danger hadn't disappeared but had only become more real. After the encounter at the mall, Jake couldn't shake off the growing sense of anxiety. The memory of George's cold stare haunted him, and the feeling that something terrible was about to happen became his constant companion. At first, it was subtle. In the evenings, when Jake was in his room, he noticed a shadow flitting by the window. He looked up, but there was no one there. Then, at night, he woke up to a strange rustling noise outside the window. Jake got up and cautiously approached the window, trying to see what was happening, but the darkness concealed any clues. He went back to bed, trying to convince himself that it was just his imagination. But soon, things took a more sinister turn. One morning, as Jake was getting ready for school, he noticed something strange by the front door. Upon closer inspection, he found a small envelope lying on the doorstep. Inside were only a few words written in a crude hand, I know where you live. We will meet again. Jake's heart froze. He didn't want to believe it was real, but the letter in his hands was too tangible to ignore. His fingers trembled as he reread the ominous note. At that moment, it became clear. This was not just his paranoia. Jake felt the fear flare up inside him once again. He felt as if he was no longer able to control the situation. He saw signs of being watched everywhere: footsteps behind doors, fleeting figures in window reflections, faint creaks in the floorboards when he was alone in the house. He could no longer feel safe at home or outside. Jake understood that the situation was spiraling out of control. With each passing day, his anxiety grew, and he felt increasingly that his life was in danger. He knew he needed to do something, but with each new day, it became harder to make decisions. Fear paralyzed him, making him feel helpless and vulnerable in the face of an unknown threat. Each day, fear became increasingly unbearable. The letter on the doorstep was the final straw for Jake. He knew he could no longer live in constant fear and needed to take action. His determination to confront the threat began to grow within him, despite the ongoing anxiety. The first step was to gather evidence. Jake started documenting all the strange calls he received. Every night, he listened to voicemail messages and recorded all the anonymous calls that might mean something. These recordings were short and contained only static or unexplained silence. But Jake was convinced it wasn't just a coincidence. He also began more active surveillance. Every night, he set up a camera on a tripod near the window, capturing suspicious shadows and movements around the house. At first, it was just faint lines and dark spots, but Jake believed that every detail might be important. He started noticing that someone frequently passed by his house, especially during the dark hours. Once Jake had collected enough evidence, he decided to share it with close friends who were aware of his fear. One of them was Michael, his longtime school friend who had always supported him. Michael, sensing the concern in Jake's voice, agreed to help. He offered not only moral support but also technical assistance, helping to analyze the recordings and checking the suspicious shadows. Another key ally in this endeavor was Amy, a friend of Jake's who was also worried about what was happening. Amy took on the task of organizing a meeting where Jake could share his findings and discuss the next steps with his friends. That evening, when they gathered at Jake's house, the atmosphere was tense, but the support from friends gave Jake confidence. Amy and Michael carefully reviewed the recordings and photos Jake had taken. They discussed every detail, every call, and every suspicious shadow. This collaboration was important for Jake, as it not only helped him systematize the information but also alleviated his sense of isolation. His friends proposed a plan of action: they would continue the surveillance, keep in touch with the police, and gather more evidence to convince law enforcement of the seriousness of the threat. Gathering his courage and feeling the support, Jake decided to go to the police again, this time with convincing evidence. He felt that now he had something more than just fear. He had determination, a plan, and loyal friends ready to help him in this fight. Night fell over the city, and Jake sat by the window once more, watching the dark street. The shadows he had seen so often now appeared more distinct, and the sounds of footsteps outside seemed more pronounced. This time, Jake couldn't simply ignore what was happening. He felt that the night had come for a decisive action. Having prepared in advance, Jake gathered his friends Michael and Amy. They met at his house and discussed the plan as soon as darkness fell. Jake felt that with his evidence and the support of his friends, he could finally confront his terrifying threat. As suspicious sounds became audible again, Jake, Michael, and Amy, armed with cameras and recorders, went outside. From the darkness emerged a figure, and Jake felt his fear transform into determination. It was George. He stood by Jake's house, his large hands gripping his phone tightly, as if listening, as though preparing for something. "George!" Jake shouted, trying to keep his voice steady. George turned around, his eyes filled with surprise and anger. "You're back again?" Jake stepped forward. He held out the recordings and photos he had collected, presenting them to George. "Here's the evidence. We know you're watching me, and we're not staying silent." Michael and Amy turned on their cameras, capturing everything. George, seeing them, began to grow agitated. His face darkened, and he started moving toward Jake as if preparing to attack. The police arrived promptly. When the officers reached the scene, George, noticing them, attempted to flee, but it was too late. Jake and his friends watched as the police surrounded the house, apprehended George, and neutralized the threat. After George was arrested, the officers thanked Jake for his determination and the gathered evidence. They informed him that George would be held until the trial and that they would continue to investigate his activities. Jake felt a sense of relief but also understood that this was not the end of his struggle. Although he could now breathe a little easier, The fear and tension that had haunted him had not completely vanished. But with this final step, he felt he had done everything possible to regain control over his life. As night turned to dawn, Jake returned home with Michael and Amy. The smiles of his friends and the sense of accomplishment gave Jake confidence. Several months had passed since Jake and his friends confronted George in the final showdown. The police had completed their investigation, and George was back behind bars, this time facing much more serious charges. His arrest was based on the evidence gathered by Jake and his friends, as well as new testimonies that confirmed his harassment. The court proceedings were lengthy and complex, but ultimately, George was found guilty on several counts, including threats and stalking. The sentence included a long prison term and mandatory treatment, providing Jake and his loved ones with a measure of justice and peace. As Jake returned to his normal life, he felt that he was not quite the same person he had been before. His daily routines and worldview had changed. He could no longer ignore the anxiety that occasionally surfaced when he was alone. Nevertheless, Jake began to feel more confident. He resumed his studies and spent time with friends, trying to lead a regular life. It took him some time to adjust to his new reality, but he found that he had become more resilient and determined. The experience had left a deep mark, but it had also given him a valuable understanding of his own strength. With the support of friends and family, Jake found ways to cope with the lingering fear and stress. He sought help from a psychologist, who assisted him in dealing with his inner turmoil and fears. Gradually, he began to rebuild his trust in others and in himself. Jake understood that his life would never be the same as it was before, but he also realized that he had managed to confront his fears and protect himself and his loved ones. This victory over his greatest threat in himself was a significant lesson, showing him that even in the darkest moments, one can find the strength to fight and overcome. With a newfound sense of confidence and inner strength, Jake continued to build his life, certain that he was ready to face any challenges that might come his way. The school year began, and Jake was determined to fully immerse himself in school life once again. He signed up for sports competitions that once seemed like mere hobbies. Now, they had become not only a way to stay physically fit but also a means to rebuild his self-confidence. At the school competitions, Jake demonstrated remarkable perseverance and diligence. His training and involvement in the team became an important part of his life. And he once again felt connected to something greater. Jake also started planning for his future. He spent a lot of time thinking about what he wanted to become and realized that he wanted to help others who found themselves in difficult situations. Jake decided that he wanted to pursue a career in social work or psychology, aiming to support and assist people who had experienced trauma and hardships similar to those he had faced himself. At school and among his friends, Jake noticed that people were beginning to see him as a new person, more confident, strong, and mature. He no longer hesitated to talk about his interests and dreams, and he was open about sharing his experiences with those who were willing to listen and support him. One evening, as Jake sat on a bench in the park surrounded by the friendly laughter of his friends, he felt that the fears of the past were nothing more than shadows behind him. The moon shone overhead, and Jake gazed at the stars, feeling that he had everything he needed to build a bright future.